Good evening, welcome to Scotland at 7. Today it's Wednesday the 25th of May. I'm Hugh Stewart in the Glasgow studio. Our main story tonight, we're going to be looking at the Sue Gray report into illegal lockdown parties held at number 10 Downing Street and other government buildings, but more of that in a few minutes. But first of all, I'm going to begin with an update on Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. Today brings us to day 91. Russia's military campaign in Ukraine has entered its most active phase, according to Ukraine's Defence Ministry spokesperson Alexander Motuzianik. Battles being fought in eastern Ukraine could determine the country's fate. He added the situation on the Eastern Front is extremely difficult because the fate of the country is perhaps being decided there right now. Russian forces have taken control of 3 Donetsk region towns, including Svitlodarsk, according to the regional governor Pavlo Kirilenko. Earlier today, it was reported that Russian forces had entered Svitlodarsk and hung up a Russian flag over the city administration building. The governor of Ukraine's eastern Lugansk region said the situation there is only getting worse as Russian troops advance. The situation is very difficult and unfortunately it is only getting worse. It's getting worse with every day, even with every hour, said Governor Serhiy Gaidai. They are simply eliminating Severodonetsk from the earth. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba said the Russian offensive in the Donbass is the largest one on European soil since World War II. He urged allies to speed up deliveries of weapons and ammunition. The UK's Ministry of Defence says that Russia has increased the intensity of its operations in Donbass as it seeks to encircle Severodonetsk, Luhansk and Rubizny in order to place the whole of Luhansk Oblast under Russian occupation. Ukraine is gathering the bodies of dead Russian soldiers found in the formerly occupied towns in the hope of exchanging them for prisoners of war or for Ukrainian bodies. In Kharkiv, 60 bodies were retrieved and stacked in a refrigerated rail carriage. Ukrainian prosecutors have launched a war crimes investigation into Kharkiv's Gorky Park, which was hit by about 50 shells in 3 months of war. Hitting civilian targets, civilian infrastructure, trying to kill civilians and destroy cultural heritage are considered war crimes. An error can happen once or twice, but there are 56 hits recorded. It's not an accident. They were targeting the park, Ukrainian prosecutor Roman Petrenko said. A new survey has found that 82% of Ukrainians believe that their country should not sign away any of its territories as part of a peace deal with Russia under any circumstances. Research at the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology found that only 10% of respondents found it would be acceptable for Ukraine to concede territory in order to achieve peace. Turkish officials met with Swedish and Finnish delegations in Ankara today to discuss NATO's bids by the 2 Nordic countries. Finland's Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto said his country and Sweden would send delegations to the Turkish capital to try to resolve its opposition to their applications to join the military alliance. And the Turkish Foreign Ministry has confirmed the meeting. A Russian court has rejected an appeal from opposition leader Alexei Navalny against a 9-year prison sentence he is serving for large-scale fraud and contempt of court, charges which he denies. Navalny lambasted President Vladimir Putin during the court hearing, casting him as a madman who started what he called a stupid war in Ukraine based on lies. That's our Ukraine update. And before we move on to the Westminster story, we must first of all deal with that dreadful story from Texas, which came in after we went off the air last night about the mass shooting in Uvalde School in Texas. President Joe Biden has called for tougher gun controls and asked why is the US willing to live with this carnage after a teenage gunman murdered at least 19 children and 2 adults in the country's deadliest shooting in nearly a decade. The suspect, identified as Salvador Ramos, who was 18, charged into the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, which is about 80 miles west of San Antonio. That was about 11:30 on Tuesday morning, shortly after shooting his grandmother, who survived. wearing body armour and carrying two assault rifles reportedly bought on his 80th birthday. He went from classroom to classroom, officials said, in the worst shooting at a US school since a gunman killed 20 children and 6 adults at the Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut back in 2012. A visibly shaken President Biden later urged Americans to resist the powerful gun lobby, which he blamed for blocking the enactment of tougher firearms laws. Flags will be flown at half-mast until sunset on Saturday in observance of the tragedy, the president said. As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? Said Biden. When in God's name are we going to do what has to be done? Why are we willing to live with this carnage? He said he was sick and tired of it, adding, we have to act. This attack came 10 days after a deadly racist rampage at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York State that claimed 10 lives in a predominantly black neighborhood. Authorities have charged an 18-year-old who they say opened fire with an assault-style rifle. Repeated mass shootings in the US have often led to public protests and passionate calls for stricter background checks on gun sales and controls that are common in other countries, but almost none have overcome strong Republican-led resistance. Recent attempts in Congress to expand background checks on firearms purchases failed to get past the Senate, where the Democrats need at least 10 Republican votes to overcome objections in the form of a filibuster. US media outlets identified 4 child victims of the shooting, all aged between 8 and 10, after speaking to their families, and also identified both adults who were teachers at the school. Robb Elementary has about 600 pupils, mostly aged between 7 and 10. It was not immediately clear how many people had been wounded. The University Hospital in San Antonio said it had received 2 patients from a shooting, a 66-year-old woman and a 10-year-old girl, both in critical condition, while Uvalde Memorial Hospital said 15 students were being treated in its emergency room. Hours after the attack, distraught families were still awaiting word on whether their child had survived. Outside the Civic Centre in Uvalde, whose 16,000 residents, according to census data, are about 80% Hispanic or Latino, the silence was broken repeatedly by screams and wailing. In strong international reactions to the shooting, Pope Francis said he was heartbroken, adding, "It is time to say enough to the indiscriminate trafficking of weapons." President Emmanuel Macron said the French people shared America's shock and grief at what he called a cowardly shooting, while Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was deeply saddened by the news of the murder of innocent children. The suspect's motive was not immediately clear, but the authorities say he appeared to have acted alone. Police reportedly saw him emerge from a crashed car outside the school building, but despite an exchange of gunfire, could not prevent him from entering. 2 local police officers were injured in the exchange, authorities said. Teams of Border Patrol agents, including 10 to 15 members of a SWAT tactical and counter-terrorism unit, rushed to the school, Jason Owens, border police officials said. One agent who was working nearby when the shooting began rushed into the school without waiting for backup and shot and killed the gunman, who was hiding behind a barricade, according to a law enforcement source who spoke to Associated Press. State Senator Roland Gutierrez said he had been briefed by the state police, who said that Ramos had hinted on social media that an attack could be coming, suggesting kids should watch out, and that he had bought 2 assault weapons after turning 18. Investigators believe Ramos posted photos on Instagram of the 2 guns he used in the shooting, and they were examining whether he made statements online alluding to the attack in the hours before the assault, according to a law enforcement official. Firearms became the leading cause of death for US children and adolescents in 2020, surpassing motor vehicle accidents, according to a University of Michigan research letter published earlier in the New England Journal of Medicine, last month that was. The tragedy was the deadliest school shooting in Texas. In 2018, a gunman shot dead 10 people at a Santa Fe high school, and a year earlier, a gunman at a Texas church killed more than 24 people during a Sunday service, and in 2019, another killed 23 people in a racist attack targeting Hispanics at a Walmart supermarket. This Uvalde shooting comes days after the National Rifle Association's annual convention was due to begin in Houston. Texas State Governor Greg Abbott said both of its senators were among the elected Republican officials scheduled to speak at a leadership forum sponsored by the NRA's lobbying arm on Friday. And now I'm going to turn to the main story of today, which is the report by senior civil servant Sue Gray into various parties, many parties, which took place in Downing Street or other government buildings while there was a lockdown in force in England, and in particular in the City of London. The Sue Gray report, which had been leaked earlier in January, has been fully published today. It was debated in Westminster. We received a copy of it this morning just after 11, so I have it here. You might not have had time to read it all, so I'll go through the main points shortly. But first of all, in response, the SNP have issued this press release. Responding to the publication of the Sue Gray report, the SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford said, "This report is utterly damning, and the sordid details highlight the culture of boozy rule-breaking which Boris Johnson has ruled over." He went on to say that the findings once again exposed Boris Johnson's lies to Parliament and to the public. The Prime Minister's misconduct brings shame on the office he currently clings to. He has displayed contempt not only for Parliament, but to every single person who followed the rules. Those who stayed away from family, those who missed funerals, and those who lost someone they loved. This failure of leadership comes directly from the top, and the Prime Minister, in the words of the report, must bear responsibility for that culture. If the Prime Minister refuses to do the right thing and resign, then it's incumbent upon the Tory MPs to step up and finally do the right thing and remove him from office. And finally, Mr Blackford concluded by saying the bottom line is that the longer they leave Boris Johnson in office, the more damage they will do to public trust in this out-of-touch and broken UK government. Now, on that point of responsibility, I'm going to quote from the conclusions which Sue Gray has put to her report. I'll go over some of the details of Sue Gray's report in a few minutes, but let's just look at the conclusions. She comes to the conclusion that, first of all, this kind of behaviour is not normal among the civil service. She herself is a civil servant, of course, and she's pointing out that the behaviours observed at Number 10 and in other government buildings are far from normal. She also makes a point in her conclusion that leadership has to start from the top. She says that both the political and the administrative leadership failed to give leadership, and in many cases, junior members of staff who reported these illegal parties kind of felt that they had been given permission to do so because senior members, either of the administration, that is to say senior civil servants, or else leading members of the political class, including the Prime Minister, had themselves attended these events. So junior members of staff felt that they'd been sanctioned to report them, to attend them as well. So that lack of leadership is one of the points that Sue Gray has highlighted in the conclusion to her report. So we'll look at some more of the detail in the report in a minute. But of course, MPs this morning in Westminster probably didn't have time to read the report before they started debating in Prime Minister's question time at 12 o'clock. However, there was a fuller debate on the report this afternoon in Westminster, and we're going to turn to a small number of clips from that. So here's a few minutes from the debate in Westminster this afternoon.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I speak, the public is poring over the sordid details of what went on out of the public eye, behind the high gates and the walls of the Prime Minister's residence, and the report is damning. It concludes, many gatherings and many individuals did not adhere to COVID guidance. Events were attended by leaders in government and should not have been allowed to happen. Junior civil servants believed their involvement was permitted by the attendance of senior leaders. There was an unacceptable lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff. And crucially, Mr Speaker, the senior leadership at the centre, both political and official, must bear responsibility for this culture. That leadership came from the top. And the Prime Minister, in the words of the report, must bear responsibility for the culture. A fish rots from the head. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's dispatch box denial of a party taking place on the 13th of November is now proven to be untrue. He was there on the 13th of November, photographed, raising a toast, surrounded by gin, wine and other revellers. The charge of misleading Parliament is a resignation matter. Will the Prime Minister now finally resign? This Prime Minister has adopted a systematic, concerted and sinister pattern of evasion. Truthfulness, honesty and transparency do not enter his vocabulary. It is just not part of his way of being, and it speaks for the type of man that he is. Credibility, truth, morality all matter, and the Prime Minister has been found lacking time and time again. He can shake his head, but that's the reality, Prime Minister. Ethics have to be part of our public life, and ethical behaviour has to be at the core of the demeanour and the response of any Prime Minister. The Prime Minister brings shame on the office and has displayed contempt not only to the members of this House, but to every single person who followed the rules. They stayed away from family, those who missed funerals, those who lost someone they loved. So when the Tory members opposite retire to the 1922 committee this evening, I hope they will bear in mind the now infamous government advert featuring a desperately ill COVID patient. It said, "Look into her eyes and tell her you never bend the rules." If they don't submit a letter, if they don't remove this Prime Minister, how will they ever look at their constituents in the eye ever again?
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a damning report about the absence of leadership, focus and discipline in Number 10, the one place where you expect to find those attributes in abundance. I made my point and my position very clear to the Prime Minister. He does not have my support. But a question I humbly put to my colleagues is, are you willing, day in and day out, to defend this behaviour publicly? Can we continue to govern without distraction, given the erosion of the trust with the British people? And can we win the general election on this current trajectory? The question I place to the Prime Minister is now, Mr. Speaker, I'm being heckled by my own people. If we cannot work out what we're going to do, then the broad church of the Conservative Party will lose the next general election. But my question to the Prime Minister is very clear on the question of leadership. Can he think of any other Prime Minister who would have allowed such a culture of indiscipline to take place under their watch? And if it did, would they not have resigned?
Hello.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sometimes wonder if the Prime Minister has a neck of pure brass. Does he understand and recognise the words honesty, integrity and accountability? No. Because from my position, I don't think he does. Many members have spoken of personal things and personal tragedies they've gone through. The country needs a new leader. Yes, we need to move on, but we shouldn't need to lead on with you, Prime Minister. Will you now resign?
Janet Charry.
Speaker, neither I nor my Edinburgh South West constituents would wish to live in a state where the government of the day could influence the police in the exercise of their duty to investigate without fear or favour. So we're puzzled as to why the Prime Minister didn't receive questionnaires in respect of 3 gatherings where other people in Number 10 received questionnaires. And we're also puzzled as to why the ABBA party in the Prime Minister's flat has never been investigated either by Sue Gray or the Metropolitan Police. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what can be done by way of an independent investigation to assure me and my constituents that the Metropolitan Police have not been nobbled?
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I asked the Prime Minister about Sue Gray's interim findings on the 31st of January, he asked me to wait for the inquiry report. He asked many members that day to do the same thing. Subsequently, he's asked the media to wait for the findings of the report, and he knows that many colleagues on these benches have told their constituents they're waiting for the inquiry report. So I was very surprised to read in the Times the intimation that he may have asked Sue Gray not to publish the report at all. Is there any truth to that suggestion, Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, what Sue Gray has published is entirely for Sue Gray, and it is a wholly independent report, Mr. Speaker.
So that was part of the debate this afternoon in Westminster. We heard from a couple of Conservative MPs, Aaron Bell and Tobias Elwood. We also heard at the end there from Joanna Cherry, and she's from the SNP, and that clip started, of course, with Ian Blackford, whom we quoted earlier. So Mr Blackford again was repeating his call for the Prime Minister to resign, not so much for having parties, but for lying to them in the House of Commons, because up to now that has been the convention in the House of Commons. If a government minister actually lies and misleads the House deliberately, then that's a resigning issue. Well, it used to be a resigning issue, but it doesn't seem to be any longer. So as I said, we have the Sue Gray report in front of us. It's been waited for a long time. And what Sue Gray has done is to look at individual parties, some of them, but not, as Joanna Cherry pointed out, the famous ABBA party. So for some reason that one's been missed out. However, she has gone into several parties in great detail, and her method is simple. She has first of all stated what were the lockdown rules at the time, and then she showed how many people are known to have been at the party. Now, to cut a long story short, the lockdown rules generally meant that no more than 2 people inside or 6 people outside could meet at a gathering. 2 people or 6 people. Furthermore, they should be normally socially distanced by 2 metres. So time after time, for several parties, Sue Gray has gathered all the evidence, including photographs, and she's demonstrated quite clearly that there were many more than 2 people. Now let's look at one, for example. She quotes the emails where people were invited to this party. This was on December the 10th, 2020, for example. An email was sent from the Secretary of State's private office internally within the Department of Education, inviting approximately 50 staff to have a socially distanced festive drinks. Now, the legal context here, of course, is that the government had decided to, as the paper said at the time, cancel Christmas, but Christmas was not cancelled in Whitehall. This isn't number 10, though. This is at the Department of Education, but we'll come to number 10 shortly. So the email from an official said, "Hi, we're planning to have some socially distant festive drinks in a canteen on Thursday. It would be great if you could join us." Many people in the country, no doubt, would have felt it would be great if they could join anyone at that time. So this was open to private office staff and ministers if they are around. It was supposed to be a virtual Christmas gathering. Now, Sue Gray has found that approximately 20 to 30 staff gathered at the canteen from about 5 o'clock on December 10th, invited to bring their own bottle. There was wine at the event, as well as mince pies. So there were certainly more people than there should have been, according to the London lockdown rules at the time. Also, Sue Gray reports on the 15th of December of an online Christmas quiz. But this online quiz, which was apparently going to attract about 150 to 200 people online, also involved a lot of people meeting in the one room. There was something like 18 people in very crowded space. So clearly social distancing and greater than 2 people, clearly those rules were breached. There's many other examples of that too, which again are listed in detail in Sue Gray. There's a couple of points that stick out to me. First of all, one of these meetings was to say goodbye to the Prime Minister's press secretary, a gentleman called Lee Kane, I think that's his name. And he was, in fact, earlier on commenting on some of the parties, and then he was a subject of the party himself. But his comments were negative. Looking at one of the emails inviting people to one of these parties, Kane said, "This maybe doesn't look very good from a comms point of view." In other words, he was saying, keep quiet about it. If this got out in public, it really would not look good. And later on, of course, there was a party held for him. So Kane and others in further emails have said, well, if we are going to have this event, then let's make sure that nobody sees it. We need to be very careful, he said. we need to leave by the back door. People are advised to be very careful not to show any wine bottles because there might be press photographers outside. So there's several remarks like that in the emails where people have said, yes, there is going to be a party, and clearly it's not going to be 2 people. So in that case, let's us all be very careful. Let's make sure that nothing gets out, and particularly that there's no pictures. So of course, these pictures have eventually been leaked by somebody. So I think what that says is that some of the officials, certainly the communications officials, knew that they were breaking the rules, and they knew that that would be serious political damage if it got out. And so they were telling people to sneak out the back door or sneak out the side door. There's several emails to that effect. It's also interesting, we were discussing in the office earlier on today that why so many of these events were for leaving dues. We don't know why that is, but there's over a dozen leaving dues. So it seems a lot of people have been leaving the Prime Minister's staff during that period. Okay, so that's the gist of it. Now let's have a look at the ABBA party. Joanne Sherry drew attention to that one earlier on today, and she was wondering why that was not investigated. And this, of course, is part of the Sue Gray report. Sue Gray says up to a point she was going to investigate the supposed ABBA party sing-along in Boris Johnson's flat. However, Sue Gray says she dropped that investigation because the Met Police wanted to look into it. But as Joanne Cherry asked in the House of Commons today, in that case, why did the Met not look into it? Was the Met being lent on by the government? And she's saying that's surely one of the first principles of a democratic state, is that the police will pursue its investigations and will keep going until they find the evidence. They will not be put off because it's inconvenient for the government. So we won't have any further information on the ABBA party, which apparently the Prime Minister's wife was holding in the Prime Minister's flat, again in breach of the London lockdown rules which were enforced at the time. Okay, so the Sue Gray report has plenty more evidence on what were the rules and several parties where those rules were broken, both inside and outside. There were also several meetings outside in the garden of Number 10, and several of these meetings involved a lot of alcohol. There are reports which Sue Gray also quotes of staff being so drunk that they actually broke some apparatus, broke a children's swing in the Downing Street garden. There's also a party inside Number 10 where staff were so drunk that an altercation took place. One staff member was sick, and people had to come and clean up in the morning. Now that brings me to the last point. I'm going to look at Sue Gray's conclusion. Ian Blackford himself made some reference to her conclusions because, of course, as he said, Sue Gray says what obviously grew up in Number 10 during that period was a culture of drinking, a culture of boozing. Parties which started off being small and careful and socially distanced ended up being bigger and bigger, and eventually people felt that they were getting permission from senior officials and from senior politicians to go ahead and have these parties and not worry too much about social rules as long as they didn't let anyone see them doing it. Another important point that Sue Gray makes in her conclusion is about those people who came in after the parties to clean up. This is both security staff who were alarmed at what was going on and they came round to see what the noise was, and also about the staff who had to clean up in the morning. Sue Gray reports that these staff received abuse from officials when they complained about the parties, and she says that this is shocking behaviour and shows a shocking disrespect to the staff. She points out in her conclusions that new guidelines have been sent to government officials and departments to say that this kind of abusive behaviour of junior staff should not be tolerated. She also points out that the use of alcohol, the fairly routine adoption of alcohol as a way of working in government departments, is also something that has to be stopped, and apparently she says new guidelines have been issued on that. So I suppose the final conclusion is a conclusion that Sue Gray does not come down to should the Prime Minister resign. As a senior civil servant, Sue Gray, of course, has no comment to make on that. She says, first of all, it wasn't in the remit of her report. That's not what she was asked to report on. She was simply asked to say, did parties take place and did they breach COVID guidelines? And the answer to that is a quite clear yes, they did on many occasions. As you could also, of course, ask, was the Prime Minister aware of it? Well, of course, the several of these the Prime Minister was present. Not all of them, but he was certainly present at some of them. So did the Prime Minister lie to Parliament, and is that a resigning issue? Well, again, we have to go back to the words of Ian Blackford earlier on. There's only one constituency which can force the resignation of the Prime Minister, and that's the members of the Conservative Party in government. Will they do that? Some have been quoted recently, including one of the Conservative MPs we heard from earlier on, saying that they have now sent a letter of resignation into the chairman of the Tory Backbenchers Committee, but will that reach the required number? Well, we don't know. So far tonight, we can say that the Prime Minister has not resigned. I'm pretty sure as I sit here, he is still the Prime Minister. So that was the latest on the Sue Gray report. I'm sure it's not the last we'll hear of it. But that's it for today. So let's move on to a couple of final stories before we conclude tonight. Obviously, it's going to be a very difficult night to get hold of any members of Parliament because they're quite busy, aren't they? So I'll just read through our last two stories. The other story, which of course is not being dealt with right now, is the cost of living crisis, the economic crisis facing Britain. Households and businesses are struggling to cope with the cost of living crisis and need urgent action from the UK government, according to Finance Secretary Kate Forbes. With inflation reaching a 40-year high of 9% and forecast to rise higher, Ms Forbes has written to the Chancellor of the Exchequer today, urging the UK government to use its £30 billion fiscal headroom which it has available to help those struggling in the face of rising bills. She said the Scottish Government is already taking action now to ensure targeted support is in place within its reserved powers. Her letter states, "I'm writing to outline the pressing need to act on the cost of living crisis. With inflation reaching a 40-year high of 9% and forecast to rise higher, Brexit increasing food prices by over 6%, and the news that the energy price cap is set to rise to £2,800 a year in October, it's absolutely imperative that further action is taken to relieve the acute pressures being felt by households and businesses. The Scottish Government has already taken action and will continue to do everything we can to ensure people, communities and businesses are supported as far as possible, but given the restrictions of devolution, only the UK Government has the economic, regulatory levers and fiscal headroom required to address this urgent crisis. As you know," she says to Chancellor Sunak, "the Scottish Government has been making the case for action for some time. Even the measures you, Sunak, have already announced, the Resolution Foundation still estimates that a typical working-age household will be around £1,000 a year worse off this year. This crisis is being felt even more severely by the lowest income households, with estimates that the inflation rate faced by the poorest 10% of households will be around a third higher than that faced by the richest 10%, due to the spiralling cost of food and energy forming a larger part of their budget. All this is before the further £800 increase in household energy bills expected in October." Ms Forbes' letter goes on to say that, moreover, the UK government's disastrous Brexit policy has damaged the economy and worsened the cost of living crisis. A recent report from the London School of Economics provides evidence that Brexit has led to a substantial increase in food prices, which will hit the poorest family hardest. This has contributed to the UK having one of the highest inflation rates in the G7. She says implementing a timely, targeted and cohesive economic support package that fully utilises your £30 billion of fiscal headroom would support households and businesses which are struggling now. Continuing to delay is prolonging the impact of the cost of living crisis on incomes, economic competitiveness and inequality, and pushing households into debt and poverty, and risks pushing the UK into a recession. And Kate Forbes continued to say, "I am proposing 4 principles which should guide the response from the UK government. Firstly," she says, "ensure that the fiscal support package is targeted at the households and businesses which most need that support. The package should aim to offset the disproportionate burden of the cost of living crisis on the least well off." And she says, "I would urge you to consider that as a starting point of any package." Secondly, Kate Forbes argues an emergency cost of living cash payment to all UK households below median income tapered to provide more support to those at the lower end of the income distribution. She says, I would suggest this should be up to £1,000 to those on the lowest income to be delivered directly as cash support at periods across the financial year. Providing money directly without a link to specific bills would provide households with the means to manage the cost of living crisis. However, it is affecting them the most, whether it's in food, transport or energy bills, they offset the cost of living crisis for those on the lowest incomes. The Resolution Foundation has also called for a policy intervention of a similar design. And Kate Forbes' next proposal is that the Chancellor should permanently uprate all social security benefits by 10% by April to match the current level of inflation as proposed by the Centre for Social Justice. In April, she says, that's the Scottish Government, increased our 8 Scottish social security benefits by 6%, reflecting the higher inflation expected at that time. She also says there should be a further £25 uplift to universal credit, and this should be extended to the old legacy benefits, which still exist. Next, she says the Chancellor should increase the national living wage from £9.50 to a real living wage of £9.90 for all over 18s. There should also be a suspension of VAT temporarily on household energy bills, which she says the Scottish Government would estimate would save the average household around £100 a year at current prices. She also wants to extend the £350 energy rebate scheme to small and medium-sized enterprises and to remove the requirement to repay the £200 energy bill reduction component, which of course is just a loan. The Scottish Government also suggests removing the standing charges for anyone with a prepayment meter. The energy price increases will be felt more severely for consumers who use prepayment meters, who are often subject to higher prices for energy than through other means such as direct debit, and standing charges must still be paid even if there's no credit on the meter, and top-ups can be swallowed up before the energy can actually be bought. So in other words, it all goes to pay the standing charge and not actually to heating the house. Removing standing charges would reduce the risk of self-disconnection if people cannot afford their energy costs. Kate Forbes went on to say, collectively, we estimate this package can be comfortably implemented within the £30 billion fiscal headroom available to you, the Chancellor, even before allowing for any additional revenue from a windfall tax. Secondly, ensure the increased burden of rising energy prices is shared fairly by imposing a windfall tax applied to all companies benefiting from significantly higher profits over the pandemic and energy crisis. This, she says, is justified given the extraordinary rise in energy prices and the windfall profits this has led to. However, oil and gas companies who are disproportionately based in Scotland are not the only businesses to have profited during the pandemic and the current crisis. Any one-off windfall tax should be applied to all companies unfairly benefiting from significantly higher profits to ensure that Scottish industry does not carry a disproportionate burden of funding a UK-wide response. Thirdly, Kate Forbes asks the Chancellor to use his £30 billion of fiscal headroom against the current fiscal rules, along with any additional proceeds from a windfall tax, to deliver a timely and targeted fiscal support package. The OBR, that's the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast, published in March, estimated that the Chancellor is on course to meet his targets on public sector net debt and to balance the current budget by the year 24-25 at around £28 billion and £32 billion respectively. Your headroom, she says, to respond would be further increased by any proceeds from the windfall tax. This, she says, provides ample space to support a significant fiscal response to the cost of living crisis. In the midst of such a crisis, it would be unconscionable to hold this funding in reserve in order to fund tax cuts in future years. She says to the Chancellor, you should also give urgent consideration to relaxing your fiscal rules for the duration of the crisis to allow you to go further in your response. And finally, Kate Forbes says to the Chancellor, you should provide firm assurances about pay uplifts for our public sector workers, particularly the lowest paid, who, without support from your government to bolster their pay packets in the face of inflation, face being pushed further into poverty. A firm commitment, if reflected in devolved budgets, would give the Scottish Government the funding to provide better pay uplifts through upcoming pay settlements, helping the lowest paid public sector workers. She says, I propose these as prudent, targeted initial measures to support businesses and households through the cost of living crisis, which would still remain consistent with the Chancellor's fiscal rules. She finally says, I would also reiterate the proposals that I outlined to you before the spring statement, the Chancellor's spring budget, many of which are just as essential to support households and businesses now as they were in March. I urge you. And she went on to say she also suggests that the Chancellor should reverse the national insurance increase, which came in April, which is in fact a tax increase, that he should rebalance the policy costs element of energy bills to reduce the premium paid by households reliant on electric heating, and also help to unlock the deployment of low and zero emissions heating. She says there should be a commitment to provide a cold weather payment in the winter of 22-23 when we know that the energy bills will have risen again. She goes on to say the package I proposed above, along with these measures, would begin to address some of the impacts of inflation and the cost of living crisis on households and businesses. She says I would also recommend you consider ways you can take additional steps to reduce the increased prices in construction and prevent it inhibiting the development of public infrastructure, for example by lowering or removing VAT in the construction sector, especially for housing construction. Energy bill price increases could also be mitigated by changing the policy of the energy price cap, and she would urge the Chancellor to consider doing that before the next scheduled increase. Furthermore, consumers who are not able to utilise gas or electricity for heating, for example those who use oil and LPG, that's particularly prevalent in rural Scotland, face greater price increases without the protection of a regulated market. Action should be taken now to support them. She says, I have focused my request on those areas reserved to the UK Government, which still holds many of the levers best able to offer focused support. As you know, she says, what the Scottish Government can do is severely limited by the budget we receive from Westminster. The limitations on our ability to borrow means our spending power is also being eroded by inflation. As a result of escalating inflationary pressure, the Scottish budget for 22-23 was already reduced in real terms by 5.2% relative to the previous year. She says this is not sustainable and represents a creeping return to austerity. I would also urge you to provide additional support to the Scottish budget to allow us to provide support to households through the levers we have access to, for example, through our policy on public sector pay. We intend to use whatever additional resources we receive from any cost of living spending to do all we can to meet the challenges Scottish households face on rising food prices, energy costs and levels of pay. Although both Scottish and UK governments are faced with the same crisis in the cost of living, we do not have the same fiscal or regulatory powers to respond to these challenges. We are doing as much as we can within our resources, but without the powers to control these policy levers ourselves, the UK Government must do more. And finally, Kate Forbes recommends to the Chancellor that she would welcome the opportunity to discuss further and set out in more detail the evidence and the need for these interventions, and she says she trusts that Rishi Sunak will welcome this. Okay, so will Rishi Sunak respond? Will he speak to Kate Forbes? We'll find out later. We do hear from the Downing Street discussion, from the Westminster discussions earlier on today, that it looks like Chancellor Sunak is going to rethink the policy on the windfall tax. And it looks like he is actually going to impose a one-off extra tax on the oil and gas companies who have been making unearned extra profits. Okay, so I'm going to finish with another local story today. Nicola Sturgeon today has made history as she's now become Scotland's longest serving First Minister. So Nicola Sturgeon has today made history again as she now officially becomes the longest serving First Minister we've had in Scotland. In 2014, Nicola Sturgeon became the first ever woman to lead the SNP, and in that year she was successfully nominated by the Scottish Parliament to become the first ever woman to hold the office of First Minister. After becoming FM, Nicola Sturgeon appointed one of the world's first gender-balanced cabinets. In 2019, She was appointed the inaugural global advocate by UN for Women, which works to advance gender equality around the world. As First Minister Nicola Sturgeon led Scotland through the COVID pandemic and was widely acknowledged to have been accessible and down to earth in her daily broadcast media briefings, having achieved the highest approval rating of any of the UK's leaders. At Broadcasting Scotland, we would like to congratulate the First Minister on her historic achievement, and I can also add that I hope the First Minister makes a full and swift recovery from the COVID, which I'm afraid she fell victim to, as she pointed out last week. So we believe she's still working at home and is a bit under the weather. So let's hope the First Minister overcomes this hurdle again. Okay, that was rather a long letter and from Kate Forbes to Rishi Sunak, but I'm sure he's reading it right now. So that's it from tonight. So we finally had the publication of the Sue Gray report, and it has finally made it clear that illegal parties did take place on many occasions in Downing Street and in other government buildings, and she's also made it clear that the Prime Minister knew that several of these were taking place and that he was actually at several of them. It therefore looks quite unlikely that the Prime Minister's denials that he knew anything about these or that he knew there were parties, it's unlikely that those denials really has any credibility, which is why several members of Parliament, including Ian Blackford and some backbenchers from the Conservative parties, have today said that the Prime Minister ought to follow the tradition and, having been found to have lied to Parliament, ought to now resign. As far as I know tonight, the Prime Minister has not resigned. Okay, that's it from Broadcasting Scotland tonight, so thanks for sticking with me. Now, can I remind you all that we are supported entirely by the people who have gone onto our website, that's the link below, and we have a stalwart band of you who are paying a direct debit once a month. That's what helps to keep us going here. But of course, our fuel bills are going up as much as everybody else's. We also have big internet charges to pay. So quite simply at the moment, the money going out is greater than the money coming in. Now, that's clearly not sustainable. So we do ask you, first of all, to, if you can pay any more, if you can increase your standing order, or if you would like to start one, you will be helping to keep independent broadcasting going in Scotland. Also, if you happen to know anyone who might have some money spare and who would like to invest in a television station, get in touch. Thirdly, if you can't do that, we know everyone's feeling a pinch at the moment, I am too. If you can't do that, then please spread the word on social media. If you like what we're trying to do in Scotland, give us a hand, Broadcasting Scotland, give us a hand, pass it on, tell a friend, and let's see if we can increase our viewing numbers, and let's hope some of those people will help to pay to keep Broadcasting Scotland on the air. So we're back tomorrow with Scotland at 7. That's all from me tonight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.